On the 30th of May, 1832, a gunshot was heard ringing out across the 13th arrondissement in Paris. A peasant who was walking to market that morning ran towards where the gunshot had come from and found a young man writhing in agony on the floor, clearly shot by a dueling wound. The young man's name was Évariste Galois. He was a well-known revolutionary in Paris at the time. Galois was taken to the local hospital, where he died the next day in the arms of his brother. And the last words he said to his brother were, "Don't cry for me, Alfred. I need all the courage I can muster to die at the age of 20. Now, it wasn't in fact revolutionary politics for which Galois was famous. But a few years earlier, while still at school, he'd actually cracked one of the big mathematical problems at the time. And he wrote to the academicians in Paris trying to explain his theory. But the academicians couldn't understand anything that he wrote. This is how he wrote most of his mathematics. So the night before that duel, he realized that this possibly is his last chance to try and explain his great breakthrough. So he stayed up the whole night writing away, trying to explain his ideas. And as the dawn came up and he went to meet his destiny, he left this pile of papers on the table for the next generation. Maybe the fact that he stayed up all night doing mathematics was the fact that he was such a bad shot that morning and got killed. But contained inside those documents was a new language, a language to understand one of the most fundamental concepts of science, namely symmetry. Now, symmetry is almost nature's language. It helps us to understand so many different bits of the scientific world. For example, molecular structure, what crystals are possible, we can understand through the mathematics of symmetry. But on a larger scale of biology, actually symmetry is very important because it actually communicates genetic information. I've taken two pictures here and I've made them artificially symmetrical. And if I ask you which of these you find more beautiful, you'll probably be drawn to the lower two, because it's hard to make symmetry, and if you can make yourself symmetrical, you're sending out a sign that you've got good genes, you've got a good upbringing, and therefore you'll make a good mate. In Granada. This is a palace celebrating symmetry. Recently, I took my family, we do this rather kind of nerdy mathematical trips, which my family love. This is my son, Tomé. You can see he's really enjoying our mathematical trip to the Alhambra. But I wanted to try and enrich him. I think one of the problems about school mathematics is it doesn't look at how mathematics is embedded in the world we live in. So I wanted to open up his eyes up to how much symmetry is running through the Alhambra. And you see it already. Immediately you go in, the reflective symmetry in the water. But it's on the walls where all the exciting things are happening. The Moorish artists were denied the possibility to draw things with souls, so they explored a more geometric art. And so what is symmetry? The Alhambra somehow asks all of these questions. What is symmetry? When are two of these walls, do they have the same symmetries? Can we say whether they discovered all of the symmetries in the Alhambra? And it was Galois who produced a language to be able to answer some of these questions. And for Galois, symmetry, unlike for Thomas Mann, which was something still and deathly, for Galois, symmetry was all about motion. What can you do to a symmetrical object? Move it in some way so it looks the same as before you moved it. I like to describe it as the magic trick moves. What can you do to something? You close your eyes, I do something, put it back down again, and it looks like it did before it started. So, for example, the walls in the Alhambra, I can take all of these tiles and fix them at the yellow place, rotate them by 90 degrees, put them all back down again, and they fit perfectly down there. And if you open your eyes again, you wouldn't know that they'd moved. But it's the motion that really characterizes the symmetry inside the Alhambra. But it's also about producing a language to describe this. And the power of mathematics is often to change one thing into another, to change geometry into language. So I'm going to take you through, perhaps push you a little bit mathematically, so brace yourselves, push you a little bit to understand how this language works, which enables us to capture what is symmetry. So let's take these two symmetrical objects here. Let's take the twisted six-pointed starfish. What can I do to this starfish which makes it look the same? Well, there, I rotated it by 1/6 of a turn, and still it looks like it did before I started. I can rotate by 1/3 of a turn, or 1/2 a turn, and put it back down on its image, or 2/3 of a turn, And a fifth symmetry, I can rotate it by 5/6 of a turn. And those are things that I can do to the symmetrical object which make it look like it did before I started. And what about the triangle? Well, I can rotate by a third of a turn clockwise or a third of a turn anti-clockwise, but now this has some reflectional symmetry. I can reflect it in the line through x, or the line through y, or the line through z. Now we go back to the walls in the Alhambra. Here are two very different walls, very different geometric pictures, but using the language of Galois, we can understand that the underlying abstract symmetries of these things are actually the same. For example, let's take this beautiful wall with the triangles with a little twist on them. You can rotate them by 1/6 of a turn if you ignore the colors. We're not matching up the colors, but the shapes match up if I rotate by 1/6 of a turn around the point where all the triangles meet. What about the center of a triangle? I can rotate by 1/3 of a turn around the center of the triangle, and everything matches up. And then there's an interesting place halfway along an edge where I can rotate by 180 degrees, and all the tiles match up again. So rotate along halfway along the edge, and they all match up. Now let's move to the very different looking wall in the Alhambra, and we find the same symmetries here and the same interaction. So there was a 1/6 of a turn, a third of a turn where the Z pieces meet, and then the half a turn is halfway between the 6-pointed stars. And although these walls look very different, Galois has produced a language to say that in fact the symmetries underlying these are exactly the same. And it's a symmetry we call 6-3-2. Here's another example in the Alhambra. This is a wall, a ceiling, and a floor. They all look very different, but this language allows us to say they are representations of the same symmetrical abstract object, which we call 4-4-2. Nothing to do with football, but because of the fact that there are two places where you can rotate by 1/4 of a turn and one by half a turn.